Hi there, welcome to a series of videos called English for Emerson. On this channel we do a little of everything. Lately we've been talking about early American history. There are some themes that kind of repeat in this series of lessons, and one of which is that high taxes cause a lot of problems for governments and for people and end up a lot of times causing major changes in the world. It's like taxes that are low, they're able to kind of go along no problem, and people are willing to comply and are willing to pay. But once they get past a certain point, things begin to get destabilized and it causes problems. And people either find a way around paying the taxes or they fight back. This has been common throughout history, and we're going to see this play out again today in this lesson. You know, the nation of Great Britain fought a war with France in the 1750s and 1760s called the French Indian War. The French had control of America down around Louisiana, down around the area of the Delta, where the Mississippi flows into the Gulf of Mexico. They also had control up around the St. Lawrence River, up in what is now Canada, in the Great Lakes area. And they wanted to have control all the way up the middle of America, up through the Midwest, from Louisiana all the way up to what is now modern Quebec up in Canada. They wanted all the control over all that land. And the British said, no, we have all of the East Coast of America, and we don't want to be cut off from the rest of America by the French. We need to have control over this of this territory. So this war was fought. And Britain was losing the war until they decided we need to really take charge of the situation. We're going to pay what is now modern day Germany to go to war with France, and we're going to blockade the St. Lawrence River to the north, and we're going to blockade the Mississippi River to the south with our navy, and we're going to basically just starve the French out and wear down their army by having to fight with the Germans. And eventually it worked. In 1763, the British had won this French Indian War. The only problem was they had incurred a huge amount of debt by paying all this money to the Germans to fight with the French. Governments tend to accumulate these debts. It's just easy to borrow money when you're a big government, and they get far into debt. And what do they do to pay it off? Well, there's a few strategies, one of which is to print more money. You just print it out. Well, if you do that to pay off your debts, you debase the currency. You make the money more worthless the more you print. And then you have huge problems with inflation. Well, that's a bad strategy, but governments do it all the time. The other thing that you can do is raise taxes. And this is the route that the British government took with the colonies. Prior to that time, they had not really taxed the colonies. They just pretty much left them to govern themselves. But now they needed money, and they decided to start taxing the colonies. They started with the sugar tax in 1764, basically saying any sugar that you import and sell in America, in the colonies, you have to pay a tax on it, and you have to send that money to Great Britain. Well, the colonists were outraged. It was the first time they'd had to really send tax money back to Great Britain. They didn't like it much at all. This was followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, and this was a big one. This was a tax on every single piece of printed paper, like newspapers, magazines, advertisements, any kind of bill of sale, any kind of college diploma. Anything that was printed had to have a stamp on it that cost money. And you had to pay this money for these stamps. This money went back to Britain to pay off this huge debt. Well, the Americans were extremely angry about this tax, and they started to fight back. They made a group of these colonists came together. I think it was called the Sons of Liberty. Liberty meaning freedom. They wanted to be free of this taxation from Britain. And they were particularly upset about the fact that they were being taxed, but they were not being represented in the British Parliament. There was no representative in the British Parliament from the colonies. They were just simply paying taxes with having no say over how things went, and that made them really, really mad. They, in a lot of ways, refused to comply with the Stamp Act, and it was finally repealed, which means it's taken away, it's taken back. But it was followed up by another tax in 1767 called the Townshend Act. And this put taxes on glass, paper, tea, and other basic necessities that were imported and sold. The colonists got even more angry about these taxes. They did not want to pay. This led to a huge riot in Boston. A riot is where people get out in the streets and break stuff and protest and throw things. A British soldier got knocked down by a piece of wood, and he got up and fired his gun. And a bunch of other British soldiers panicked, and they fired their guns. And several colonists got killed. This is called the Boston Massacre. This happened in 1770. This is kind of the beginning of the American Revolution, when people start getting killed by British soldiers. People got very upset. In 1773, there was the final straw. It was called what you'd call the straw that broke the camel's back. It was just all these things kind of added up. The Tea Act of 1773 was basically Britain declaring a monopoly on the tea trade. What is a monopoly? I'll put it up on the screen. It means you have total control over the supply of a product in a local area. You are the only supplier. You have a monopoly. Imagine that, like, there was a town out in the middle of, some area out there all by itself, or some city or some town, and you're the only gas station in the whole town. And you don't allow anybody else to build a gas station. You only can buy gas from me. Okay? That means you have a monopoly on the local gasoline market. Well, the British, they declared a monopoly of the tea trade. And tea was a very, very popular thing to consume at that time. It's a popular part of British culture to have your morning cup of tea. This led to a huge protest that's very famous in America called the Boston Tea Party. People were so upset about this monopoly on the tea trade that about 100 guys, all dressed up like Native Americans — they were not Native Americans, but they were dressed up in costumes, in disguise — they all went out into the Boston Harbor and got aboard in the middle of the night a ship from the East India Tea Company, and they opened up all of the cartons and they dumped 92,000 pounds of tea out into the Boston Harbor in the middle of the night. And then they all got out of there without being caught. I believe, I don't think any of them got caught. I'd have to look that up and make sure, but I don't believe that they did. So they destroyed about $3 million worth of tea. Well, this outraged the King of England at the time, named King George III. He had been in charge of these taxes. He was the ruler at the time, and he was an extremely stubborn man. Not really a bad king, but very, very stubborn. And he said, listen, there is no way I'm going to be having these rebellions going on in my colonies over there in America. They will pay, and they will do what I say, and I am not going to put up with this kind of outrageous behavior. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a blockade of the Boston Harbor. And we've talked about these blockades before on this channel. They're a very common tactic in warfare. And he used the British Navy to make sure that no ships could go in or out of the Boston Harbor at that time. No fishing boats, no trading ships, no rowboats, nothing. Well, you have to understand that at that time we didn't have automobiles. Ships moved goods because the only other way you could get things around was in a wagon. And it effectively shut down the entire city of Boston, which was not a huge city at the time, maybe only 20,000 people or something like that. But it kind of doomed them to starvation. And he thought, you know what, I'm not going to let this blockade up until they pay back this $3 million. And until they stop these crazy rebellions, I will not put up with this. Well, the other colonists heard about this, and they said, well, we're not going to let Boston starve. And so they took their horses and their wagons and everything and secretly kept bringing in food to get around this blockade so that Boston would survive. And Boston did not pay back that $3 million that they had cost the East India Tea Company in terms of destroying all that tea. And they did not submit to King George III. They said, no, we're not going to put up with this. We will not pay these taxes. We will not pay the money back. We want to be represented in Parliament, or we want to be able to go our own way. And we certainly don't want to pay any more of these absurd taxes. Well, King George III, being a very stubborn guy, responded by saying, okay, I'm sending more British troops, and I'm going to work you up, and I'm going to buckle down on you. And this brought forth the American Revolution. And we'll talk about that more next time on English for Emerson. Bye-bye.